All right, good afternoon, Akron. I'm Stephanie. All right, good afternoon, Akron. I'm Stephanie Marsh. I'm the Chief Communications Officer.
Start the process of presenting the Jayland Walker case to a Summit County grand jury. As that being the case, it's good to talk to everybody about what is a grand jury, what does it do, and how does it fit in our criminal justice system. This is meant to be just informative on the basics. Certainly there's no information on the specifics, but just to give everybody an overview of the process. A grand jury, there's two types of juries in our criminal justice system. There is a grand jury and a trial jury, what can also be called a petit jury. A trial jury is what most of us are much more familiar with. It's a trial that we're used to seeing in the news, the media, or in sources of entertainment. It's a group of jurors in a courtroom. It's very formal. There's a prosecutor representing the state of Ohio. There's a defendant. There's a defense attorney representing a defendant. And there's a judge presiding over the whole proceedings. A trial jury represents the end of the criminal justice system. It's where a defendant is declared guilty or not guilty. A grand jury represents more the beginning of the process, and truly represents the formalization of felony level offenses in the state of Ohio. There's a couple different paths in which a matter can end up being presented to a grand jury, but the important part is all felony matters flow through a grand jury as the beginning of the process. One path is through a law enforcement officer. If a police officer arrests somebody and charges them with a felony level offense, they utilize a provisional or temporary complaint that starts the process moving forward, but ultimately to become an indictment, to mature into a formal felony offense, that case must pass through a grand jury. The other path is a prosecutor can choose to just directly present a matter to a grand jury. This is done often in situations involving extremely lengthy investigations that involve a high volume of evidence and complex legal issues. A grand jury does not determine guilt or innocence. The purpose of the grand jury is to determine whether sufficient probable cause exists to charge a person or persons with a particular offense or offenses. If the grand jury determines that there's sufficient probable cause to charge an individual with an offense, that formalizes the complaint into an indictment, and it starts the traditional criminal justice process. I mentioned a standard of proof, probable cause. There's a variety of different standards of proof in the legal system. And of course, a lot of people are more familiar with proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That is the highest standard of proof we have in our legal system. It's reserved for a criminal trial, and it requires the state to prove somebody guilty beyond a reasonable doubt before somebody can be found guilty and sentenced for a crime. The grand jury deals with a different standard of proof, and that is probable cause. But it's a lower standard than proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and really essentially means that there's sufficient facts to believe a particular person committed a particular offense. And if a grand jury, again, believes there is probable cause, then that causes them to indict an individual, and again, it starts the process moving forward. What is the composition of a grand jury? Well, the most important aspect of that is a grand jury for any type of case is composed of the citizens of Summit County. Every citizen who is at least 18 years of age, a resident of Summit County, and registered to vote is a potential grand juror. It's much like a lottery system. The potential pool that does not utilize any type of demographic information. If you're over the age of 18, a resident of Summit County, and you're registered to vote, you could be a grand juror. And so that is where the potential pool of grand jurors comes from. Now, of course, in many situations, you bring in a large group of people, and then you slowly select the individuals that you need to serve ultimately on the grand jury. So let's talk a little bit about the selection process. Now, a grand jury is comprised of 9 people, but what they will typically do is also have 3 to 5 alternates. The purpose of that being, particularly if you're presenting a lengthy investigation, the last thing you would want to have happen is a grand juror become ill or have a family emergency, and then you have to start the process all over again. The reason you have alternates is in case something like that were to occur, an alternate can take their spot in the group of 9 that will ultimately decide a matter, and then the presentation can just continue because the alternates have heard up until that point all the information that the original jurors heard. The selection process, and this is a distinction between trial juries and grand juries. In a trial jury, the selection process is conducted by the prosecutor, the defense attorney, and the court. The prosecutor is present in the courtroom, the defense attorney is present in the courtroom, and the judge is present, and all of those parties can ask questions of potential jurors during the selection process. A grand jury is much different. A defense attorney does not have a presence during the selection or presentation portion of a matter before a grand jury. The selection is conducted by the judge with the prosecutor present. Now, what type of questions would be asked? But the purpose of the selection process is to develop the most fair and impartial jury possible. And so certainly the judge and or the prosecutor is going to seek out any potential bias that could affect a person's ability to be fair and impartial. Now, the bias could be something as simple as just a family member in law enforcement, a person with a husband or wife or child that's in law enforcement. It doesn't mean that they couldn't be fair or impartial. It just means because that relation exists, it's best to excuse them from potential jury service, and that way it promotes the most fair and impartial jury possible. Another thing that might get someone excused from jury service is a family medical emergency. If somebody is being questioned to be a potential juror, and in their personal life they're caring for an elderly family member, and that takes up a great deal of their time, then in that case you probably don't want them to sit, because what we ultimately want is all of our jurors to be able to invest their time, energy, and attention so that we get the most fair and just outcome possible. The grand jury is again distinguished from a trial jury in the sense that the grand jury proceedings are confidential. Now, the purpose of that is to protect the identity of the grand jurors themselves. You don't want to be in a position where there's any undue influence placed upon a juror, any type of juror, that will affect their ability to be fair and impartial. Now, though the grand jury proceedings are confidential, the grand jury proceedings are recorded, and we'll get to that as we get to the presentation section. But one thing that is of interesting note, once the grand jurors are discharged and they're no longer in the service, they fulfilled their service and their role, grand jurors can choose to identify themselves, and you'll see that on the news, where after the matter has been closed, one way or the other, a grand juror might sit down and have an interview with a reporter or whatnot. So they're not under any admonition to keep their identity confidential until the proceedings, once the proceedings are finished. Let's talk about a little bit about the presentation of evidence to a grand jury and how the jurors ultimately deliberate. We've been told, because of what we're reading in the media, is that the representative or representatives from the Attorney General's office plan to take approximately a week to present the evidence in the Jayland Walker case. What would that evidence look like? Well, it's going to be testimonial. Witnesses will testify. Various forms of electronic evidence, such as video, body-worn camera images, pictures, and even audio. It could be forensic evidence, and even forensic experts may testify as well. That's just an example of what it could all be. The understanding is that the Attorney General's office will present all 8 officers involved in the Jayland Walker case to the grand jury. Now, the defendants in any criminal case have an opportunity to testify, certainly. That includes at a trial jury, or that includes at a grand jury. But a very important distinction between grand juries and trial juries are if a defendant wishes to testify before a grand jury, they do it without their attorney. As I mentioned earlier, a defense attorney does not have a place in front of the grand jury, and therefore, if a defendant wishes to testify on his or her own behalf in front of a grand jury, they would do so without the presence of a defense attorney. The grand jury is a little bit different from a trial jury in that it's a little bit more personable. At trial juries, jurors are generally not allowed to ask a lot of questions, and if they do, it's very structured. It goes through the judge. It's very structured on how that question gets to the witness. That's not the case with grand juries. Grand jurors can ask all the witnesses questions and often do so. As I mentioned earlier, though the grand jury proceedings are confidential, they are recorded. They are recorded. All of the evidence given to the grand jurors, whether it's testimony or reports or video, it is recorded. Their deliberations are not. And in the grand jury process, the judge provides them the basic law. And I mean the basic law on how they are to operate, how are they to conduct themselves as grand jurors, how are they supposed to conduct their deliberations. The prosecutor provides them the law of the types of offenses that may apply to a particular incident. And then if the grand jurors have questions, they can, at times, seek instruction from the judge into specifics of the law. Ultimately, once the judge instructs them and the prosecutor provides them the various laws that are applicable, the jurors begin to deliberate. And probably the most important distinction between a trial jury and a grand jury is a trial jury requires a unanimous verdict. That means all the jurors must vote that somebody is guilty or not guilty. That is not the case for a grand jury. In a grand jury, as I mentioned earlier, 9 people will hear the matter, and it requires 7 of 9 people to agree that there's probable cause to charge somebody. Again, 7 of 9 people have to agree that there's probable cause to charge somebody. It does not require a unanimous vote. Now let's talk about what that ultimate result is. There's a few terms that you'll hear frequently, and I'm going to explain those a little bit when we talk about what it looks like when a grand jury decides to make its decision and report out. I will say these things happen very fast, so though we have some timeline from news sources from the Attorney General on how long it will take to present the matter, we have no idea on how long it will take grand jurors to deliberate on the matter. All we can ask is that they take everything into consideration, put their full time, energy, and focus, and come up with the most full, thorough, and just result possible. So what you may hear when a grand jury makes a decision is you may hear one of 2 words. You may hear the phrase true bill, or you may hear the phrase no bill. A true bill means that a person has been indicted. and that there's now formal felony charges pending against a person or persons. And what would happen next is the traditional criminal justice process. That person would then be arraigned before a judge. There would be various pre-trial conferences where the prosecutor and a defense attorney determine what's going to happen in the case. Is the individual going to resolve the matter and plead guilty? Is the individual going to want their trial? And then ultimately there might be a trial. The other phrase that you might hear is no bill. No bill means that the grand jurors did not find sufficient probable cause to charge a person or persons with a particular offense. It represents a closure of the criminal matter against that individual. There's certainly other things that may happen, but that person isn't going to be subject to any further criminal culpability. So again, true bill or indictment means that an individual has been charged, and it will now begin the traditional criminal justice process against that individual. And no bill means that the person is not charged, that the grand jurors did not find sufficient probable cause, and they are discharged from any further criminal culpability. Since there's a group of individuals, 8 officers involved in this particular incident, it's important to note that this is not an all or nothing decision. In other words, yes, all 8 officers could be indicted and charged with some offense or offenses. Vice versa, all 8 officers could be no billed and all discharged from any further criminal culpability. But there could also be a combination of those two. Hypothetically, 5 officers could be indicted or true billed and charged, and 3 officers could be no billed and they're discharged from any further criminal case. So we don't know. There's a lot of variables that we're all walking into, but it's important to note that it's not all or nothing. The grand jury, one important question that keeps coming up is, does the grand jury sentence offenders? And that is not the case. As I mentioned, if the grand jury does find probable cause and true bill or indict somebody, that's just the beginning. Sentencing is at the discretion of the judges, and that is at the conclusion of the criminal justice process. It does not happen by way of the grand jurors. The most important thing to know about any grand jury, whether it's the one involving the Jayland Walker case or the hundreds that occur here in Summit County every month, all grand jury decisions are decisions of citizens just like all of us and just like all of you watching this live stream right now. And with that, I'm going to bring back in Ms. Marsh, and we're going to try to take any questions that might help clarify what's going on.
All right. First, thanks, Craig, for that. Appreciate that. I know we did just give a lot of information there, so folks may need some time to process that. We do have our Akron Updates website that has a nice explanation that is a little bit simpler. We have the website up behind us here. So that does have some of that information that Craig just gave. It's a little bit maybe easier if you can just read it. So feel free to go to the akronupdates.com sites for that information.
So a couple questions from the audience and from our messages. How has the city been preparing for the grand jury results?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Okay. So really the preparation for grand jury results started last summer. And the most important preparation that we've been doing has been building up relationships with our community partners and groups. We've been having conversations with faith leaders, business owners, activists and organizers, residents of all kinds. Really just trying to make sure that we have open lines of communication and that we know how our community is feeling and the sentiment that exists out there. So that preparation has been the most important that we've done, and people don't see that one quite as much. Certainly we are preparing for all possible outcomes. We did see a little bit of violence last summer, and so we feel it's the city's responsibility to be prepared for that again. And so that's, you may have seen, there's some boards on the windows at City Hall just on that first floor corridor. So that's another way that we've prepared. We're also working to set up a demonstration zone to allow folks the ability to come out in sort of a prime area for that kind of activity, and to do so safely without having to worry about vehicular traffic coming through. We want to make that space available for folks should they want to come out. So there's a lot of different preparation that's involved, and it's ongoing. Those conversations, though, will continue throughout this entire process.
When will the grand jury make a decision?
Great. Back to you.
And unfortunately, and I addressed it somewhat during the lesson portion of the live stream, but we're not going to know. We know that the process is going to begin on the 10th. That's the one thing we know for sure. We know that there is going to be a large volume of potential grand jurors, because this is a special grand jury. The special grand jury is just in the sense that it's only going to hear this matter and this matter alone. The traditional grand jurors sit for weeks and hear hundreds of cases. We know that the matter is going to begin, selection and presentation is going to begin on the 10th. We have a rough estimate, only because of what we've heard in the news, that it's expected to take a week to present the evidence. The variable, the unknown that we don't have is we don't know how long it will take jurors to deliberate. So in other words, could a decision be announced in 2 days? After they get all the information, it could. Could it take a week? It could. We simply don't know how long it will take the grand jurors to deliberate. And again, I mentioned it, all we can ask for is that they take their time, their focus, and their energy to come to the most fair and just decision possible.
What is the Akron Updates website for? Can you speak as to why we created this resource?
Yeah, absolutely. And Jake, I don't know if you have the ability to scroll at all on this. Maybe we can show some folks what's on here. So the Akron Updates website, though, is to kind of put everything, it's a one-stop shop for any sort of safety information that folks need to be aware of, real-time road closures if we were to have to close something down. There is more information on the demonstration zone on there. There's, as you can see, there's civil demonstration, what to know is on there, so that's your rights as a protester if you do choose to come out. Some downtown business resources, mental health resources. So really, again, it's just kind of a one-stop shop. It's going to have the latest and most up-to-date information. So I would encourage everybody bookmark that page. Again, that's akronupdates.com. That's going to have the latest information available as things start to unfold in the coming days and weeks.
What is the city hoping to gain from these demonstration zones?
Yeah, I think ultimately we've had a lot of conversations with different cities who have had kind of trauma in their corridors as well, and talking to them about best practices and what worked well for them. And what we heard from several cities was that setting up specific space so that folks can come and demonstrate and exercise their First Amendment rights, air their grievances, petition their government for the change they want to see, creating that space intentionally and setting that there for a certain period of time has worked well for other cities, and we wanted to create that same kind of safe area for folks to not have to worry about traffic, to know that if counter protesters were to come, that we'll be on hand to make sure everyone stays safe and peaceful. We understand that folks may want to demonstrate elsewhere, right? We understand folks may want to march. People have a First Amendment right to protest in designated areas and outside of them. The city will absolutely support and protect the right of our citizens to their First Amendment rights wherever they choose to do that, as long as that's done nonviolently in a peaceful way. We will support those rights. But the idea of the demonstration zone is really to create specific space for folks to come in and exercise those rights.
Question from News 5. With demonstration zones set up, is the city prosecutor concerned that there could be violence after the decision, and how will the prosecutor handle charges against protesters who may cross the line with peaceful protests?
Sure, that's a good question. We will address it in the same manner as we addressed the incidences of last summer. As Ms. Marsh mentioned, we respect people's First Amendment right to peacefully protest. And she mentioned the phrase nonviolent, and we'll just lean right into that. The the types of things that will cause a protest to transition into people being arrested is when windows are being smashed and fires are being set and people's they're being subjected to potential physical harm. And as mentioned, this isn't necessarily directed specifically towards law enforcement. It's people in the crowd getting upset with one another, tempers flaring. Ms. Marsh mentioned counter-protesters. Ultimately, what the city and the police want the most is for anybody that comes out to protest to go home safely after the protest, for anybody that witnesses or the media who are bearing witness to the protest to go home safely, and for the police officers to go home safely. If someone crosses the line, if somebody damages or destroys property, sets a fire, attacks somebody, threatens somebody, if somebody crosses the line, we're going to charge them just as we would charge anybody else who commits a crime. And we'll prosecute those cases in the same manner we would do anybody else.
It's the end of questions. If you guys want to give any closing remarks before we finish off.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for coming and giving this presentation. This is the same sort of presentation that's been given in our community to all kinds of different community groups, and we felt it was important to come on here and give it to everybody here on Facebook as well, just to get some information out there. If you have further questions after this, again, I would encourage you to go to that akronupdates.com site. There is a form you can fill out on there that will send an email to us with your questions, your concerns, your thoughts. So please feel free to utilize that. We'll be paying attention to that as things continue on here. So yeah, that's all I have. Anything for you?
Perfect.
All right. Bye, Akron.
Thank you, everybody.